what do you need to prepare for your session? It's one of the reasons why you hear me as often as you might, is because I don't think many books, if any books, do a really good job of telling you what to do when you need to sit down to prepare for a fantasy role-playing game. There are definitely some systems that do. One recently that I heard about was Mothership, where people were talking about how Mothership says, take a piece of paper and write this stuff down. The game Dungeon World, the fantasy version of Apocalypse World, had a really good idea of like, this is what your first session looks like and the stuff you should prepare for it, and this is what your other sessions look like. And many of those ideas are ideas that helped inform my decisions and my thoughts about building the 8 steps from Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master. So I have my own sort of instruction for what to do when you're sitting down and prep your game. If you watch my YouTube show, I do a Lazy GM prep show that I've now done for I think like 3 years and hundreds of sessions where you can watch me go through those steps while I'm preparing for my own role-playing game. I started that show specifically because people said, hey, I read your book, but I'd really love to see you do the prep. And so I was like, yeah, it's a good idea because I have to prep for my game anyway. And so I have hundreds of them for many campaigns, probably, I don't know about a dozen campaigns, but like more than 5 or 6 big campaigns where I go through the 8 steps from Return. And one of my beliefs about Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master is that it's a popular book. Like, I'm very, very proud. It's a gold Annie Award-winning book, has sold many, many tens, maybe 100,000 copies. It's done very, very well. And I think one of the reasons why it's done really well is that it really narrowed down that topic of like, here's what you need to do when you're sitting down to do your prep. And it did so in a way that made it very flexible so that you could say, you know what, I don't do it that way. I want to change it slightly, and you could change it slightly. Or I want to expand this part out and do it slightly differently. And if you watch my prep videos, you'll see that that's exactly what I do. Sometimes I need more stuff and more sections than others. Sometimes I don't need a section at all and I cut it. Sometimes I need another section that I don't really have, and so I kind of fill it out. But generally speaking, that framework works. So all of this is important when we take a look at the adventure scenarios that exist inside the 2024 D&D Dungeon Master's Guide. And that's really where I wanted to bring this topic up. And if there's one main point I would like you to get from this whole conversation, if there's one thing you can grab onto that I think is really valuable when it comes to thinking about your prep, and something that I've seen, the reason I'm bringing this up is I've seen so many GMs get kind of caught around this idea, is your notes only serve you. You don't have to give your notes to anyone else. They are not the instructions that you need to give to someone else to run an adventure. They are the notes that you need to run the adventure you're going to run. And the reason this is important is because you can usually get away with a lot fewer notes than you think you can, because you already remember the stuff that you thought of when you were actually going through your prep. So this is why, like I say, when you take a map, you can print like a Dyson map and you can just write like a word on a location. And it's because that word might be enough in your mind to be able to build out the rest of it. You don't have to fill in everything out. You don't have to come up with great big, long random encounter tables, because you can roll a random encounter table before you do your prep and then plop that one in. So there's a lot of things that you can do to speed up your prep and to make your prep notes significantly smaller when you remember that they are not a published adventure. They are not an adventure scenario you're giving to someone else. They are yours for your use. And I think that context is really important when we take a look at the D&D 2024, the adventures that are inside the D&D 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide, because they talk a lot about this. So an interesting thing about the adventure scenarios that are inside the D&D 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide is they are very small. In the Dungeon Master's Guide themselves, they are 1/2 of a page. They are one column on one side of the page for the adventure scenario. And when I first heard that, they were going to be 1/2 a page big, I was like, I don't think that's enough. And not even enough from like the sense of someone writing an adventure for me to run, which is certainly very, very brief. But even in my own notes, they take up a page, right? I use a full page. I just did my prep not 20 minutes ago, and it took up 2 columns on a single piece of paper. So I was really curious about what kind of stuff they were going to include in one column. The interesting thing about these adventures, so there's 5 of these adventures. They cover a different range of levels for each one, and they are all very small. They're all again, 1/2 of a page in the Dungeon Master's Guide. There's an interesting thing about these scenarios, which is unlike your own notes that you write for yourself to run your game. These were written by somebody else to give to you. In this case, I'm guessing it was either Chris Perkins or James Wyatt that wrote these. I would guess it was probably Chris Perkins, who wrote these adventures out with the intention that they could show you how to run an adventure like this. But where people are going to get stuck or have gotten stuck is they look at this and say, could I run this adventure? And the answer could be no, because I don't know what was in Chris Perkins's head when he wrote this. The other question, though, that we want to ask is, if I wrote my own adventure notes like this for an adventure I came up with, would that be enough? And the answer to that might be yes, because a lot of the context that's missing from these notes, you would have in your head if you were the one that wrote it in the first place. Chris Perkins had ideas about how this was going to play out, and he might be able to take those notes and then run an adventure like that, playing out from the stuff that he knew. So that's one of the things that I think is a hard thing to understand about the adventures in the Dungeon Master's Guide is they are not published adventures. These are not adventures that a designer at Wizards of the Coast wrote so that they could hand it to you so that you could grab it and run with it. Now, maybe you read this and you're inspired enough to say, I actually could run an adventure from this. Like maybe I have to add a few things or I have to style it differently than I normally do. But generally speaking, I can run an adventure. Yeah, I could run this adventure, and I probably could. When I look at these, I could probably run them. You know, there's the first level. I'm going to kind of focus on like the Fouled Stream, right? The first level adventure that's there. And we looked at it. So that's the context that I think is important. You can see like it literally fits on one screen, right? I can almost fit the entire adventure. I think I can fit the entire adventure on one screen. So one question when we look at this is, if we were to write our own notes this way, if we were to kind of sit down with a piece of paper and say, I've got a bunch of people that I'm going to entertain later today with a game, what do I need in order to fill it out? Is this enough? Is this the kind of notes that I could keep? So that's something that I really wanted to keep in mind. You know, can you really get away with a half a page of notes? Are these enough? But one question I had, and this is something where I get stuck in my own rut, I think a little bit about the expectations from Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master and the things that work for me is, this is all great, but I don't know how I'm supposed to start my game. I don't know what the first thing is that happens. I don't know how to take the characters and bring them in. So these adventures have things like a situation. An alien fungus in a cave is polluting the stream that flows past the village of High Erie. The fungus has spawned vile creatures in and around the cave. That's the situation. And the hook is the folk of High Erie are noticing fungal growths on the riverbanks and a layer of scum on the water. The characters might live in the village, or a contact in the free city of Greyhawk might ask them to investigate. That's really everything you have about how to get started. And that doesn't tell you how to get started. And that's why, again, I, of course, think that what I have come up with is the right approach, which is a strong start. A strong start is step 2 of the 8 steps of Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master. The first step being review the characters, which isn't in here, but other parts of the book talk about the fact that you should understand your players and things like that. But I really think that, like, what do I do when I sit down? I got a bunch of friends of mine, they're sitting around the table, or we're sitting on a virtual tabletop, we're getting started, they're still talking about real life things, and I need to get them into the game. What do I do to bring them into the game? What's that first thing that happens? And I don't think you can sort of, and many GMs do this, which is you start passively. You're in the city, you're in the village of High Erie. There's a tavern nearby, there's a blacksmith shop, there's a town council, and there's a bunch of villagers walking around like stuff like that. What do you want to do? Oh my God, that's, I don't know, I'll go to tavern, I guess, right? I don't know, I'm going to go to the blacksmith and see if they got any fancy swords. I don't know, I'm going to wander around, right? The problem is that, like, that doesn't give anything to the players to say, hey, here's this thing that's going on. A strong start is far better. And an example of a strong start for the Fouled Stream, when maybe, like, if you're a good improvisational GM, you can come up with this, is you're walking through the village of High Erie along your journeys. All of you have traveled for some time, but you're relatively well rested. Nothing really occurred. When all of a sudden you hear a scream and a woman comes running from the nearby river, and 2 twig blights are chasing her away from the river. They are covered in weird mushrooms that are popping as these things chase after the woman. What do? That's a strong start, right? The strong start is something happens. It doesn't always have to be combat. In that case, it's combat, but 2 twig blights is going to be pretty easy to beat. So it's mostly like, come to the defense of the woman, and then the mayor will come out, and now you have a few things. Not only do you have a hook, which is weird mushroom-covered twig blights have come out of the river and chased one of the villagers, you also have a situation to draw them into the game at the same time. So to me, the strong start is more useful than a situation or a hook to tell me as a GM, or remind me, since it's my own notes, what I need to do to get things started in the game that I'm going to run. So I'm a big believer in the strong start as a way to go forward. And when I look at these don't tell me how to start. Now, again, Chris Perkins wrote them, and if he was running them, he probably would know how to start, but he didn't write that down, right? Now, maybe if you wrote your own notes and you said, well, here's the situation and here's the hook and here are the scenes, maybe you would have enough to know where your game was going to start anyway, and you didn't need to write it down. I myself think it's very valuable to write down what's the first thing that happens. My last game, which I just did the prep for recently, the strong start was Tamarly Morris Gemborn takes a walk. Right? The local pain in the ass lord of the well station that they're at is walking around, both desiring to be worshipped by the people around him and also to be kind of checking on everything, even though he doesn't know what to check on. Not a combat situation, but something is happening that's going to draw the players into the game. So I think that's something that's really interesting. What are the connectors? One of the things when I look at this is, how do you get from point A to point C? We have these encounters that says, like, a mile upstream from the village, a stream flows into the river with a little wood on the river's side, from a little wood on the river's south side. Characters can tell that the stream is a source of the pollution. Well, what got them from High Erie to go investigate the stream and go to the first fork? Also, you got to the first fork, but what's actually at the first fork, other than that you see that there's a corruption there, right? Journey upstream. So I guess they're continuing to go upstream. Bora Grove, a kindly Trent, keeps watch over the wood and meets with the characters as they follow the polluted stream. He knows the source of the corruption is inside a cave. He gives the characters a magic acorn to swallow it, does this other thing. Okay, so that's pretty interesting. But, like, I guess the idea is they continue to follow the stream, but there's nothing that's really telling me how to get from point A to point B. Now, maybe it's still enough. Maybe, again, if you wrote these notes yourself, you would know how to get them from point A to point B. You don't really need to spell that out every time. So, but that was something when I looked at this, I was like, I don't know that I don't really have connectors in my own notes. There isn't like a step in return for connectors to get people from one scene to the next. But if you look at the scenes, generally when I outline the scenes, and maybe this is good enough, is I know how they're going to get from one to the other. So that might be enough for me to figure out how they're getting from one place to the other. One thing I really like is they talk about one of the maps, right? So here we have the corrupted cave, and it says, use the Underdark Warrens map in Appendix B. We're going to open that up so we can take a look at it. So that's the Underground Warrens map. And it says, ignore the secret door and the inner chambers behind it. Close off the tunnels leading off the map to the southeast and north. The characters enter the cave in the southeast following the stream. The cave's main features and inhabitants are as follows. So you kind of like cut off, where does it have the secret? I don't see the secret entrance. So it starts in the southeast. Oh, I guess so. You can ignore this whole inner area here, right? And instead you just fill it out. One thing I really like about that is the idea that you can go ahead and take a published map and modify it to support your adventure. That's a really good lazy trick, right? I'm going to make a statement, and many of you may hear this and put your hands over your ears and your eyes are going to bug out and go, what? You don't have to make any maps. You don't have to make any maps. There are so many maps on the web. In particular, Dyson Maps. Dyson was the artist who made this map for the Dungeon Master's Guide. And there are, I think, like 12 or 15 maps like this in the Dungeon Master's Guide. But Dyson on DysonLogos.blog has 1,300 maps of this style. And these maps work great. I've been using them for years now. They're fantastic maps. They're great. You can modify them easily. You can twist them and you can turn them. You can turn them around. You don't need to draw maps. You can if you want, but don't pretend that you need to. You can, if you enjoy drawing a map out for a thing, and I've done it from time to time, but a lot of times I'm busy, and a lazy trick is grab a map and modify it, and do what they say here. Scratch off certain areas. You say, there's a rock area here, and you can print out that map, and you can draw little areas that block off just a section of that map so that you can use it for your own game when you want a smaller map. Really good trick. I'm glad they use it in here a bunch in their own things, and I think that's an outstanding lazy trick. You don't need to make a map. With all of these different adventures, like I've been poking at the level 1 adventure, but if you look at all of the adventures, one neat thing about these adventures, they all cover a different variety of types of adventures and show you how that could work. Like there's only 5 of them in here, but each of them kind of gives you an idea of what they're looking at. There's exploration and dungeon crawling. There's negotiating a situation. There's one for long distance travel. You travel for a big long while. That's the one where you're getting betrayed by your NPC the whole time. So it turns out you're wasting all your time. But other than that, you're traveling for a long time. And then there's one for dealing with a social situation. So they cover a good range and a recognition of the different kinds of situations. But the Boreal Ball, for example, the 7th level one, where you go to a ball in the Feywild and you deal with it, and it's even shorter than the other ones, right? It's a really, really short adventure. And I saw people that are like, man, I could not run that whole situation with just what's there. Like I definitely need more than that. So the idea of like the situation and the hook is a commonplace across all of them. But that's where I really think like the situation and hook could be drawn together into a few things like a strong start. So I think they're very interesting. But of course, I have my approach that I use for the 8 steps from Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master. I've spent a lot of time with them. I spent a lot of time working with them before I had written Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master. And now that it's been out a few years, I've used it myself hundreds of times. I've talked to hundreds of GMs who have used it. Every one of them says, oh, I love it, but I always do things a little differently over here, which I'm like, that's outstanding. That's how it's designed. You get to design your own prep system that you like. And that can really work. What's interesting to me is the original Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, the original book that I wrote back in like, I don't know what it was, it's like 2014, I think. It was a while back. Only had 3 steps. And those steps were, where does your game start? The strong start. What 3 scenes might take place? And what 3 NPCs might the characters meet? And my idea was you really didn't need even more than that. Now, in this case, the scenes were more like the scenes that you'd find in here. Because like you can look at these adventures and see like a scene could be a shrieker fungus just inside the cave alerts inhabitants to the character's arrival. On watch near the entrance and quick to respond are 4 bullywug warriors who have fungal growths on them, right? That's like an entire scene. And, the berserk bear, you go to a bear, but it turns out that the bear can be cured if you do this other thing. The ooze's lair, right? That's a scene. So the interesting thing is like a scene, if you look at the steps from the original Lazy Dungeon Master, scenes had a lot of stuff in them. They had NPCs in them. They had monsters in them. They had situations in them. You packed a lot into a scene. That's much bigger than the scenes that I did for Return, which was really just a list of the scenes that might take place. And then you filled out the scenes with the details you had. But it's interesting to me that this style actually sort of matches that idea of the original Lazy Dungeon Master style. Now, I found after years of using that style that it wasn't enough for me. And I wrote the book, right? This was the book that I wrote. And one of the reasons I wrote Return is that I no longer followed my own steps that I wrote about in the Lazy Dungeon Master. And it was a popular book. People liked it and people were very complimentary of it. In fact, the very first Amazon review I had for Return was, I wish it was more like the original Lazy Dungeon Master, which made me sad. And that review is still up there. But hey, whatever. It worked out anyway. And I realized like, no, there's really more that we need. And also there was this idea of like, there's even the idea of breaking up the components of our prep into separate sections so that we could improvise different scenes as they played out by pulling monsters or NPCs or treasure or secrets and clues and everything and building scenes as we go was a new approach that I took for Return. Just as a quick review, the 8 steps for Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master are: who are the characters? Where does your game start? What scenes might take place? What secrets and clues can the characters discover during the game? What locations might they explore during the game? What NPCs might they meet during the game? What monsters might they face? And what treasure they might acquire? And I spent a lot of time thinking about those 8 steps. Frankly, I don't like having 8 steps. 8 is a lot of steps. I have to think. I've written about it and talked about it and used them for years, and I still have to kind of sit and think about what are all the steps. But I really think they're all pretty vital to the. If I thought any of them weren't necessary, overall, I would have killed it. In fact, it started off with 7. It didn't have scenes at first. And then I realized we really need scenes because everybody does it. Everybody needs that loose outline of what they had. So scenes made their way back into it to 8 steps, but I was loath to add any more. And honestly, I would love a way to reduce it. And maybe you could reduce it if you start to combine the aspects of these different steps into one area, which I think is kind of what the scenarios in the 2024 Dungeon Masters Guide do. Because if you look at it, and actually Elizabeth from our Patreon, from the Patreon Discord server, she went through and took one of the notes and highlighted the sections to determine which of the 8 steps are actually in these notes just spread out. And the example, Elizabeth is the best. Yes, Robert Table says, Elizabeth is the best. Elizabeth is absolutely the best. She's a moderator on our Sly Flourish Discord. Fantastic person, a great creator, and has a lot of her own work available. So, but one of the things she did here was say, like, if we look at the 8 steps, what are the 8 steps are in here? And so yellow stuff are like secrets and clues, right? that if you were going to break out secrets and clues, the things that the characters could learn, the alien fungus is in a cave polluting the stream, that's a secret. The fungus has spawned vile creatures around the cave, that's a secret. Fungal growths on the riverbanks and a layer of scum in the water, that's a secret. The tree ant keeps watch over the wood, that's a secret. So there's lots of secrets that are buried among these scenes in the situations and in the encounters. Locations, the locations are kind of the pink color. Oh no, I'm sorry, those are scenes. So the scenes are kind of the pink color of like the journey upstream, the corrupted cave, and the journey home. Those are kind of the main scenes. The monsters are highlighted in orange. You have Trents and twig blights and shrieker fungus and bullywugs and a brown bear and psychic ooze and sturges. Treasure is highlighted in green, magic acorns and staff of flowers. One thing you won't see though is that strong start. The strong start really isn't in here. There isn't a thing for that. So it's kind of interesting that a lot of times, and I think that this is absolutely true, that if you were to follow this style of prepping for your game, of thinking of your game like this, like from the encounter standpoint. One little trick about the word encounter is I use the word scene. And the reason I use the word scene is I feel like a lot of GMs, when they hear encounter, they think combat encounter. D&D and the style guide for D&D uses encounter to mean any scene. And they even refer to it as an encounter is a scene like a scene from a movie. So that you can use those two terms interchangeably. And when I speak to it, I will use the term encounter and scene interchangeably, but I tend to call them scenes. And one interesting thing, one little metric that I think is really important for a scene is when you're preparing your game, you can generally expect a scene to take 45 minutes of gameplay. So if you have like 3 or 4 hours, you want to account for how many scenes that you need in order to fill those out by assuming that they're going to take about 2 scenes for every hour and a half or 4 scenes in 3 hours. I usually like to have like 5 scenes on hand if I have a 3-hour game, just in case some of them go a little faster. And you might have a scene that doesn't take place, and you can always like cut a scene if you need space for things. But generally speaking, you can assume that a scene is going to take about 45 minutes. Some will be faster, some will be longer, but generally if you're timing them at that idea of about a scene about every 45 minutes, you're probably, generally speaking, you're probably going to have the right of it. But be prepared to decrease those scenes if you need to finish everything in that time frame. Or you could just pass a scene and skip it and then do it next time you get together if you're doing a longer campaign. So I thought that was really interesting, of like the idea that you this is reverse engineering, right? That you can pack the 8 steps, or at least many of the 8 steps, into the adventure scenarios that they do. Really, the other way is the way that it occurred, that generally speaking, I think GMs start by building out their adventures in a pile of scenes that include like any secrets that they could learn, any NPCs they might meet, any monsters they might fight, any treasure they might acquire. And all of those are kind of, and the location where they're doing that is all piled into that one encounter. The NPC is there or not, monsters are there or not, treasure is there or not. If you look through any published adventure, that's kind of how they do it, right? Like you go to a location, the location has a description of the location, the description of the NPCs and monsters that are there, the treasure that they might acquire there, any kind of lore or secrets that they might pick up. All of those are sort of piled into those encounters, which means that, that's kind of like fewer steps. But I believe that Return, and the way that we break it out in Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, is important because it lets you improvise those scenes. You might decide that those monsters aren't in that room, but they are in another room. And now, because your monsters are separated out, you know that you can move them from one area to another. It's also a little bit easier to reference them when you have them in their own section, versus having them kind of buried among an encounter. But it really kind of depends on the style that you've got. One thing that I think is interesting about all this, and something that I've already talked about, is of course when you're working with the 8 steps from Return, you can always eliminate steps you don't need. If you realize, like, I don't need an NPC section because I do have them in my secrets and clues, and I have them in my scenes, I have them somewhere else, you don't necessarily need to have them in there. You can cut those. And anybody that watches me do my own prep notes will see me sometimes say, yeah, I don't need to have a section for that. I've already got that covered. Like today, and we can look at the notes that I did for my game today. This is a really good example because I did it just minutes ago. So this is the notes that I have for my game today. I have the characters because I like to have the characters in front of me. I want to have their names. I want to have their thoughts in there. I have my strong start, which is, 6 words is enough for me to know that that's all I need. I don't have to explain what's going on here or why. That's just a reminder to me about what's going to happen. I'm not giving it to you so you can run this adventure. I'm keeping it myself so I can run the adventure. But here I have scenes, right? And I have like traveling down the mountain path, and I have the path as the eastern mountain range, south of the 440 fingers, large fungi with floating balloon-like pods anchored. I stole that from an encounter scenario inside the Game Master's Guide, and I said hobgoblin brigands, former soldiers who are hostile and desperate. So I've got location information, I've got monsters in there. I did list my monsters out separate. I wrote hobgoblins in my monster section. Probably didn't need to do that. But I already have my location in there, which is why you don't see a location section of these notes. I was like, you know what? I don't really need to fill them out. I also didn't have time. I'm kind of done. But you can see, like, I've got tons of secrets and clues going on in here. I've got a lot of lore in the game that I'm running. And I really think the lore is important. And I think that the adventure scenarios that they have in the Dungeon Master's Guide don't offer nearly enough lore or ideas of the world that they're going in. What I think's interesting about this is if you look at Dragons of Stormwreck Isle, the latest starter set, the D&D starter set, which was written by James Wyatt, it's fantastic. It is a really, really good adventure. And one of the things it does is it's both a fantastic introductory adventure for DMs and players to learn how to play D&D. But it already has a lot of lore in there. It's got stuff about Orcus. It's got stuff about the Nine Hells. It's got stuff about Tiamat. It's got stuff about Bahamut. It's got like lots of lore going on in there that you as a DM can grab onto and learn from. Like, especially as a new DM, you don't know any of this stuff and you can learn from that. The 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide has a lot of that lore. It's got a fantastic cosmology section that talks all about the outer worlds. And a lot of the stuff about the outer worlds is stuff you could learn even if you don't go to the outer worlds. You just learn about the outer worlds. Big Greyhawk section that's got tons of like specific nouns about specific nouns about Greyhawk that you could grab onto. And it's got the lore glossary with lots of things like who was Hadar. I thought that was interesting. Hadar is a big dying sun, a big angry dying sun. I didn't know that. So lots of different lore that you can pick up in there. That lore needs to be in your scenario in these sections. That's why secrets and clues is such an important thing for me. Look at it. It dominates my notes, right? It is half my notes are those secrets and clues in this case, because that's the stuff that's really going to make this game different than every other game my players play. My players have been playing for decades. We have more than maybe like 200 years worth, 300 years worth of experience playing D&D combined at that table. I gotta make interesting new things for them to learn, and that's in Secrets and Clues. Fighting hobgoblins, they've fought hobgoblins before, but why? And what can they learn about these particular hobgoblins and what's going on with them? That is the interesting thing. So, that's where I really feel like some stuff needs to be filled out more than we might think. One other little bit, and this is really for continuing adventures, is like one of the things that I want to expand upon on the 8 steps is that idea that one of the things you can do, and I do this typically in the scenes section, is what are the options that are going to lead the players down the next path? So I think it's really important to focus on the notes that you need in order to run the game that's in front of you. I've got a game that's going to be happening in an hour, and I need to have notes together for that section for an hour. I've got a game in an hour, and I want to focus my time and attention on that game. I want to make sure that game is going to be as fun as I can. However, if we're getting to the end of that scenario, I want to know what's going to happen next. And a lot of times what I like to do is offer 3 options that the players can grab onto to decide where they want to take the game next. I like 3 options. I like to make them pretty different so that they can really steer the kind of game that they want to steer and that they're not just following one significant path. So one of the things I will do is in those scenes, if I believe that they're coming up to something next, I'll say, here are the other next 3 options of things that are going to occur. Which one do you want to pick? I don't have to worry about that today, because today I don't think we're going to get through everything that I'm planning to run. We got a lot of stuff going on in today's game. So I don't believe that I'm going to have to come up with that option next. But I probably, the game after next, absolutely, I'm going to have to say, what are the next ones? So that's something that I do. Another thing I've been talking a lot about is the idea of printing a map and annotating it by hand. You could take those maps in the back of the Dungeon Master's Guide. You could take a picture with your phone and print it to, I don't know, your school or your office printer or whatever if you don't have your own, or you could print it on your own printer. Printer's pretty good investment, I think, for a Dungeon Master. Even if you're playing remote, it's nice to have physical stuff. And take a pen and just annotate it. And I've talked about this on Sly Flourish. You don't need to put tons of detail about every room, right? You can come up with that. Maybe you need more details if you really want to fill it out. But I think like stretch your improvisational muscles a little bit and write smaller room descriptions, and then think about what would be there and talk about that at the game. Use that to help you improvise and come up with stuff. There's tons of random lists that you can find from many, many different publishers, and almost all the Game Master's Guides have details of things that you can drop into particular rooms. The original 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide had tons and tons of tables to help you fill out the details of various chambers. It was really good, and that stuff is not in the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide. So having both guides is actually going to be of value to you. But you can read through those just to get ideas, but then when you're at the table, you can actually stretch your muscles a little bit and improvise the kinds of things that they would find in the various locations. But it means that when you're actually prepping a map, you could prep probably 20 or 30 rooms in about 10 minutes just by writing down what you think is in what room. That's something that I do. It stretches my mind, and I really like that. And another tip I always have is when you're keeping your notes, write the page numbers of the monsters. One nice thing about the notes that are in this Dungeon Master's Guide in the D&D Beyond version is they are linked to the monsters, so you can click on the monsters right there. But if you're making your own notes, of course, you won't have links like that. So use the hyperlink that has been around for 5,000 years, which is the index or the page number, and write down the page number next to the monster so that when you have the book in front of you, you can look it up. I, of course, did not follow my own advice when I did these notes, and you can see a bunch of monsters and they don't have page numbers. So do as I say, not as I do. So again, the main thing I want you to get from all of this, the main thing I think you should get from reading Return to the Lazy Dungeon Master, which I very much hope you will read. And by the way, you can get a free sample of Return to the Lazy Dungeon Master on the page that has it. It's a pretty big sample that includes descriptions of the 8 steps. You can also get a lot of information from Return to the Lazy Dungeon Master, including a lot of really good rollable tables on the Lazy GM's reference document, a Creative Commons release document that I put out last year. So you can get a lot of material, but the book is also really cheap. It's $8 in PDF and includes an EPUB version and a PDF version. So, it has a lot going on there. And I would suggest you read it. But the one point I'd like you to get from reading that, but also a point that I think is really important when you are reading these scenarios from the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide, is that your notes are just for you. You only need to follow the steps that you need. You don't need to follow any other steps that anybody else is doing. You don't need to look at the way that I prep my game and say, well, I'm going to prep it exactly like Mike does. You prep the way that you need it. The only thing I would recommend to you is try to prep as little as you need in order to run the game that you need to run. That you can let the game itself fill out all the details as you're running it. You may find that there are things that you really struggle to improvise. I'm terrible with names. I always need to write NPC names. I need to have a list of names in front of me, and I need to remember the names of previous NPCs because I'm terrible with names. I cannot improvise them very well. A lot of people can't improvise those really well. Details for rooms, I don't really have a trouble with. Motivations for NPCs. I've heard other people that have talked about how it's really hard for them to get in the head of an NPC and really come up with something, so they need more notes about NPCs. For me, I usually have the name of the NPC, and that's all I really need, because I can already know who they are, what they want, and I can get into their head and think, if I am Master Kiprak, the secret cult leader of the lower left hand of Nakresh, whose holiest duty is to steal from the Dragon Empire, I already know how to act. Oh, and by the way, I'm really smart. I already know how to act. I know how to put myself in Master Kiprak's shoes, and then when the characters are interacting with them, I know how he can work with them. I know how that can play out. And a lot of times, even if I didn't think about that ahead of time, I can improvise a character pretty well. And I think a lot of GMs have to, because a lot of times the players will come up with characters that you didn't prepare anyway. So what I would offer, I asked this to Matt Mercer, and then when I was talking to Matt Mercer many years ago about this, not to name drop, but we have a video where he and I had talked about this stuff. And he said that he improvises about half of the NPCs that came up. I don't know if this is still true, but it was true back then, that he was improvising half the NPCs. So my argument would be, if you have to improvise half the NPCs anyway, why are you putting in a lot of details for the ones that you don't improvise? Right? Because they will hang on to the character that you improvised, and now they're their new best friend. Do you really need anything more than that? And again, all I need are names. So I would say, if you're able to improvise NPCs well, do you need to do anything for the ones that you're not improvising? Like that's a big point. But again, the notes serve you. You don't serve the notes. You don't serve the game. You don't serve me. You don't serve anybody else other than you and your players. And that means that the notes that you take only have to serve you and the game that you're going to run for your players, so that you and your players can have a great time while you're hanging out together. I think that's the main message I would take. I think that is a strong message that you can take by looking at these example adventures in the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide. And hopefully that's a lesson you take from reading my own work in Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, when we talk about the 8 steps for game prep. If you enjoyed this show and you want to see more stuff like this, please consider subscribing to the Sly Flourish newsletter. You can find a link down in the show notes. It's absolutely free to sign up. You get a free adventure generator for signing up, and you get a weekly RPG article sent to your inbox that includes links to all of the other work that I do. You can also join me on Patreon. Patrons of Sly Flourish get access to all kinds of tips, tricks, tools, scenarios, and other things to help you run your 5th edition games. You get access to the awesome Lazy DMs community, and you help me put on shows like this. And you can pick up any of my books, including Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, the Lazy DM's Companion, the Lazy DM's Workbook, Forge of Foes, and more at the Sly Flourish bookstore. Thank you all so much. Have a great day, and get out there and play an RPG.